In the autumn of 2014, a photograph emerged from the depths of a forgotten archive in Springfield, Illinois. It had been tucked inside a leather portfolio, wrapped in tissue paper that crumbled at the touch. The image itself was unremarkable at first. A family portrait, taken in 1909, posed in the rigid formality that defined an era obsessed with propriety and permanence. 5 figures stood in a parlor, their faces stern, their postures unnaturally stiff. The father's hand rested on his wife's shoulder. 2 older children flanked the parents. And at the center, slightly forward, stood a young boy, no more than 7 years old, his eyes wide and unblinking. The photograph bore all the hallmarks of its time. Sepia tones bleeding into the edges, a vignette darkening the corners, and the grainy texture of early gelatin silver print. The family wore their Sunday best. High collars, dark wool, and lace that seemed to suffocate rather than adorn. Behind them, barely visible in the dim interior, hung a large oval mirror with an ornate gilded frame. It reflected the window opposite, the faint outline of a chair, and the shadow of the photographer's tripod. But something was wrong. At first, the archivists who catalogued the image saw nothing unusual. They recorded the date, the location, the studio mark embossed faintly in the lower right corner. They noted the family's clothing, the Victorian wallpaper, the gaslight fixture hanging from the ceiling. Then one of them, a woman named Margaret Hayes, who had spent 30 years restoring damaged photographs, paused. She leaned closer, adjusting her magnifying glass over the mirror in the background. Her breath caught. In the reflection, 4 figures appeared. The father, the mother, the 2 older children. But the boy at the center, the one standing closest to the camera, the one whose face was the clearest, whose small hands were folded neatly at his waist, cast no reflection at all. The mirror showed the room behind him, the empty space where he should have been. It was as if he were a shadow given flesh, present in the photograph but absent from the truth the mirror revealed. Margaret called over her colleague. Then another. They checked the negative, examined the plate for scratches, searched for signs of retouching or double exposure. There were none. The photograph was intact, undamaged, and impossibly precise. The boy was there, and yet he was not. Whispers began to circulate among historians and collectors. Was this a technical anomaly, a quirk of early photography that no one had documented? Or was it something else? Something deliberate, something the family had chosen to preserve in this single, frozen moment? The photograph was dated March 17, 1909. The studio was identified as Whitmore & Sons, a reputable establishment that had served Springfield's wealthier families for decades. The family's name was eventually traced through census records and property deeds. The Caldwell family. Father, mother, 3 children. But the more researchers dug, the more questions arose. Why would a family commission a portrait with such an impossible flaw? Why would the photographer allow it to be printed, distributed, framed? And why, in all the records that survived, did this boy's name appear only once, and then vanish from every document that followed? The photograph that shouldn't exist became the photograph that refused to be explained. And as the years passed, as more eyes studied that empty space in the mirror, one truth became undeniable. This was not a mistake. This was a message, a confession, a warning left behind by people who knew that some truths can only be told through silence. The photograph arrived at the desk of Dr. Julian Myers, a specialist in early photographic processes and a consultant for museums across the Midwest. He had spent decades unraveling the mysteries of damaged, altered, and misattributed images. He had seen double exposures that created phantom figures, light leaks that erased faces, and chemical degradation that transformed portraits into abstract nightmares. But when he placed the Caldwell family photograph beneath his microscope, he found none of those familiar culprits. The gelatin silver emulsion was intact. No scratches marred the surface. No signs of retouching, no painted over sections, no added layers of pigment. The exposure was even, the focus sharp. The mirror's reflection was rendered with the same clarity as the rest of the image, every detail of the room behind the family captured with meticulous precision. The gaslight fixture, the pattern on the wallpaper, the curve of a chair leg, all of it appeared exactly as it should. Except for the boy. Dr. Myers consulted with colleagues who specialized in the physics of light and reflection. They explained what any photographer of the era would have known. Mirrors in the background of a portrait required careful positioning. The angle had to be exact to avoid unwanted reflections, to prevent the photographer from appearing in his own image. But those same rules made it nearly impossible for a subject standing directly in front of the mirror to be absent from it. The boy was positioned at the optimal distance and angle to be reflected. The light from the window would have struck him, bounced into the mirror, and returned to the camera's lens. There was no physical explanation for his absence. They examined the possibility of a double exposure, a technique sometimes used to create ghostly effects in Victorian spirit photography. But double exposures left telltale signs. Overlapping edges, inconsistent lighting, a translucence that made figures appear layered rather than solid. The boy in the Caldwell photograph was solid. His shadow fell correctly on the floor. His clothing wrinkled naturally. He was present in every measurable way, except in the mirror. Dr. Myers reached out to archivists at the Library of Congress, who held thousands of photographs from the same era and studio. They sent him samples from Whitmore and Sons, images taken in the same room, with the same mirror visible in the background. In every other photograph, the reflections were perfect. Families appeared in the mirror exactly as they appeared in the room. There were no anomalies, no missing figures, no unexplained gaps. The Caldwell photograph stood alone. As the weeks passed, the investigation shifted from technical analysis to something more unsettling. Dr. Myers began to consider the possibility that the photograph was not flawed. It was intentional. Perhaps the family had requested this composition. Perhaps the photographer had been instructed to create an image that captured both presence and absence. But why? What purpose could such a portrait serve? He turned his attention to the family itself. The Caldwells were not famous, not wealthy enough to attract scandal or scrutiny. They lived quietly in a modest home on the outskirts of Springfield, far from the grandeur of the city's elite. The father, Thomas Caldwell, worked as a clerk for the railroad. The mother, Evelyn, was a homemaker. The older children, Margaret and Charles, attended school and church with regularity. And the youngest boy, whose name appeared in the family Bible as Henry Caldwell, was 7 years old when the photograph was taken. But when Dr. Myers searched for records of Henry Caldwell after 1909, he found nothing. No school enrollment. No medical records, no mention in city directories or newspaper clippings. It was as if, after the photograph was taken, Henry Caldwell ceased to exist, and in the mirror that hung behind his family, he had never existed at all. The Caldwell family lived at 412 Ashford Lane, a narrow two-story house with peeling paint and a yard overrun with weeds. It stood at the edge of town, where the streets turned to dirt and the gas lamps grew sparse. By all accounts, they were unremarkable. A family that attended church on Sundays, kept to themselves, and raised their children with the stern discipline common to the era. But when genealogists began tracing the family's history, they discovered something strange. Henry Caldwell existed in only one official record. The 1900 census listed him as an infant, born in February of that year. The birth record, filed at the county courthouse, confirmed the date and named Thomas and Evelyn as his parents. A baptism record from the First Presbyterian Church of Springfield placed him in the congregation as a child. But after 1909, every trace of him vanished. The 1910 census, conducted just 1 year after the photograph was taken, listed the Caldwell family as a household of 4. Thomas, Evelyn, Margaret, and Charles. Henry was gone. No death certificate was ever filed. No obituary appeared in the Springfield Daily Register. No grave bore his name in the family plot at Oakwood Cemetery. Researchers turned to the family's personal correspondence, housed in a small collection at the Illinois State Historical Society. The letters were mundane, requests for fabric from a catalog, updates on the health of distant relatives, notes about the weather and the crops. But buried within them were fragments that hinted at something darker. In a letter dated April 1909, just 1 month after the photograph was taken, Evelyn Caldwell wrote to her sister in St. Louis. "The incident has left us changed. We do not speak of it, even among ourselves. The house feels emptier, though we are all still here. The incident." The phrase appeared again in a letter from Thomas to his brother, written in the summer of 1909. "We have done what we thought best. The boy was troubled, and we could not help him. Pray that God forgives us for what we could not prevent. The boy, not Henry, not our son. The boy, as if naming him would give shape to something they wanted to forget. Neighbors who lived on Ashford Lane in the early 20th century were long dead, but their descendants remembered the stories. An elderly woman named Clara Jennings, whose grandmother had lived 2 doors down from the Caldwells, recalled a conversation from her childhood. Her grandmother had described the Caldwell family as a house of whispers, a place where the curtains were always drawn and the children rarely played outside. She remembered seeing Henry once, standing alone in the yard, staring at the street with an expression she described as too old for his face. One spring evening in 1909, Clara's grandmother heard shouting from the Caldwell house. She couldn't make out the words, but the sound carried through the windows, sharp and desperate. Then silence. Days passed. Weeks. She never saw Henry again. When she asked Evelyn Caldwell about the boy, the woman's face went pale. "He's been sent away," she said, "to family in the country. The air here didn't agree with him." But there was no family in the country. No relatives in Illinois or beyond who could account for a boy named Henry. The lie was simple, rehearsed, and never challenged. In a time when children died of illness without fanfare, when families moved frequently and records were kept loosely, a missing child could disappear into the cracks of history. And the Caldwells, it seemed, had made certain that Henry would. What happened in that house between February and March of 1909 remains unknown. But the photograph taken in that same month, a photograph where Henry stood among his family, present and accounted for, yet invisible in the mirror behind them, suggests that the truth was too terrible to speak aloud. So they spoke it the only way they could, through an image that showed the world what they had done. They had erased him, and the mirror, which could not lie, reflected exactly that. The house at 412 Ashford Lane still stands, though it has changed hands many times since the Caldwells left in 1915. The current owners, a couple in their 60s, know nothing of the family who lived there a century ago. They know only that the house feels cold in certain rooms, that doors close without wind, and that the mirror in the upstairs hallway, a large oval mirror with a gilded frame, has been there since the day they moved in. They have never thought to remove it. When researchers visited the house in 2016, they were granted access to measure the rooms, photograph the interior, and map the layout against the 1909 portrait. The parlor where the family had posed was still recognizable. The wallpaper had been replaced, the gaslight fixture removed, but the dimensions matched. And there, on the western wall, hung the same mirror. It had never left. The mirror's placement was deliberate. It faced the window, capturing the light that poured in each morning. In the photograph, that light illuminated the family from behind, casting long shadows across the floor. But it also revealed something else. The mirror's angle was perfect for reflecting anyone who stood in the center of the room. There was no blind spot, no trick of perspective that could explain Henry's absence. He should have been visible. The mirror should have shown him. Victorian homes were built with mirrors for practical reasons, to amplify light in dim rooms, to create the illusion of space. But they also carried superstition. Mirrors were believed to capture the soul, to reveal truths hidden from the naked eye. When someone died, it was customary to cover all the mirrors in the house to prevent the spirit from becoming trapped. In some families, mirrors were turned to face the wall during mourning. In others, they were removed entirely. The Caldwells did not cover their mirror. They did not turn it away. Instead, they stood before it, posed their family for a portrait, and allowed the mirror to tell a truth they could not. Behind the mirror, workers during a renovation in 1998 discovered something unsettling. The wall had been repaired, the plaster patched and smoothed over a section roughly 3 feet wide and 4 feet tall. The repair was old, likely done in the early 1900s, judging by the type of plaster used. When the workers removed the damaged section to replace it, they found a small cavity behind the wall, a hollow space that had been sealed deliberately. Inside, there was nothing. No hidden objects, no letters, no remains. Just emptiness, as if something had been removed before the wall was closed again. The workers mentioned the cavity to the homeowners, who shrugged it off as a quirk of old construction. But when the story reached the researchers investigating the Caldwell photograph, they returned to the house with renewed urgency. They measured the cavity's position. It was directly behind the spot where the mirror hung, directly behind the place where Henry Caldwell should have been reflected. Architectural historians explained that cavities like this were sometimes used to hide valuables or important documents. but they were also used to conceal things families did not want found. Evidence of illness, signs of violence, remnants of shame. The Caldwells had sealed the wall sometime after the photograph was taken. They had repaired it carefully, covered it with wallpaper, and hung the mirror back in place. Whatever had been inside that cavity, they ensured it would never be discovered. The house, it seemed, had kept the family's secrets long after they were gone. But the mirror, steady, unchanging, indifferent to time, had revealed them from the beginning. In early 2017, Dr. Myers partnered with a forensic imaging specialist named Dr. Anita Okafor, whose work had helped solve cold cases through photographic analysis. Together, they subjected the Caldwell portrait to the most advanced techniques available: digital enhancement, light spectrum analysis, and three-dimensional reconstruction. They wanted to answer one question: could Henry's absence from the mirror be explained by any known photographic or optical phenomenon? Dr. Okafor began by scanning the photograph at a resolution high enough to reveal individual grains of silver in the emulsion. She isolated the mirror's reflection and compared it pixel by pixel to the figures standing in the room. The father's reflection matched his position. The mother's dress appeared exactly as it did in the physical space. The older children were rendered with precision. But where Henry stood, the mirror showed only the wallpaper behind him, unobstructed and clear. She ran simulations using software designed to recreate lighting conditions from historical photographs. She input the angle of the window, the position of the gaslight, the height and distance of each family member. The software generated a predicted reflection based on the laws of physics. Henry should have appeared in the mirror, just as the others did. The simulation left no room for error. His absence was impossible. Next, Dr. Okafor enlisted a team to recreate the photograph in a controlled environment. They built a replica of the Caldwell parlor using dimensions from the original house. They sourced period-appropriate clothing, a mirror matching the size and style of the one in the photograph, and a camera identical to the model used by Whitmore and Sons in 1909. They posed 5 volunteers in the exact positions of the Caldwell family, adjusting for height and stance. When the photograph was taken, all 5 figures appeared in the mirror. They repeated the experiment with different lighting, different angles, different exposures. Every time, the reflections were complete. The conclusion was inescapable. The absence of Henry's reflection was not an accident. It was not a flaw in the photographic process, nor a trick of light. It was, as Dr. Myers reluctantly stated in his final report, an impossibility rendered real. But impossibilities, Dr. Okafor knew, often had human explanations. She began researching the cultural and psychological context of Victorian photography. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, photographs were not casual snapshots. They were deliberate, expensive, and freighted with meaning. Families commissioned portraits to mark milestones, to assert respectability, to leave a record of their existence. But some photographs served darker purposes. Spirit photography, a popular trend in the Victorian era, claimed to capture images of the dead. Photographers used double exposures and other tricks to create ghostly figures hovering beside the living. Families grieving the loss of a child would commission such portraits, hoping to preserve a connection to the departed. But the Caldwell photograph was not a spirit photograph. Henry was not translucent or faint. He was solid, alive, present. Yet the mirror denied him. Dr. Okafor proposed a theory. The photograph was not meant to show Henry as dead. It was meant to show him as erased. The mirror, in Victorian symbolism, represented truth. Could not be fooled, could not be convinced to show what was not there. If Henry appeared in the room but not in the mirror, it was because the family had decided, consciously or not, that he no longer deserved to be seen. The photograph was not a memorial. It was an erasure made permanent. Dr. Myers pushed back. How could a photograph erase someone? How could a mirror be made to lie in reverse, to show absence instead of presence? Dr. Okafor's answer was simple. The mirror was not lying. The mirror was showing the truth. Henry was there in body, but he had already been removed from the family in every way that mattered. And the photograph, commissioned just after whatever had happened to him, was meant to document that removal. It was a record not of who the family was, but of who they had chosen to forget. The theory was speculative, but it fit. The photograph was taken in March 1909, just weeks after the last mention of Henry in family letters. The mirror showed a family of 4. The records after 1909 listed a family of 4. The photograph, intentionally or not, had predicted the future the Caldwells were already creating. The more researchers learned about the Caldwell family, the more convinced they became that Henry's disappearance was not a tragedy. It was a crime. And it was a crime in which the entire family, and perhaps the entire neighborhood, played a role through silence. In June 2017, a historian named Paul Dennison uncovered a cache of letters written by members of the First Presbyterian Church, where the Caldwells worshipped. Among them was a note from the church secretary to the pastor, dated May 1909. It read, "The Caldwell matter has been handled privately, as you requested. No further questions will be raised. The family has expressed their gratitude for your discretion." The Caldwell matter. Another euphemism, another refusal to name what had happened. The pastor's reply, filed in the same collection, was brief. "It is better this way." The boy was beyond correction, and the family acted within their rights as parents. "We pray for their peace." The language was chilling. Beyond correction. The phrase suggested that Henry had been seen as disobedient, troublesome, a problem that required solving. In the early 20th century, parental authority was absolute. Discipline was harsh, often brutal. Children who defied their parents could be beaten, locked in rooms, sent to reformatories. And if a child died as a result of such discipline, families rarely faced consequences. The shame was private, the punishment informal. Paul Dennison found another letter, this one from a neighbor named Edith Mayhew, written to her daughter in 1910. She described the Caldwells as a family that kept its troubles behind closed doors, and mentioned that she had once heard terrible crying from their house late at night. "I asked Evelyn about it the next day," she wrote, "and she told me the boy had taken ill. But when I offered to send the doctor, she refused. She said they were managing it themselves. The boy had taken ill." Another lie, polite and plausible. No one challenged it. No one called the doctor, the sheriff, or the church. The Caldwells were left to manage it themselves, and by the time the photograph was taken in March, Henry had been managed out of existence. Researchers began piecing together a timeline. Sometime in early 1909, Henry became a problem. Perhaps he misbehaved, challenged his parents, or exhibited signs of illness that the family interpreted as defiance. In an era when mental illness was misunderstood and children were expected to obey without question, Henry's behavior, whatever it was, made him intolerable. Discipline escalated. Shouting turned to violence. And then, one night, something went too far. There was no evidence of a body. No unmarked grave, no hidden remains. But the cavity behind the wall, the letters that hinted at handling the matter privately, and the photograph that erased Henry from the mirror all pointed to the same conclusion. Henry Caldwell did not run away. He did not fall ill. He was killed, deliberately or accidentally, and the family worked together to hide it. The silence that followed was collective. The pastor offered discretion. The neighbors asked no questions. The photographer took the portrait and said nothing about the missing reflection. And the Caldwells moved forward, a family of 4, unburdened by the son they had erased. By 1915, they had left Springfield entirely, relocating to a town in southern Illinois where no one knew their name. Margaret and Charles grew up, married, had children of their own. Evelyn and Thomas lived into their 60s, dying quietly in the 1930s. None of them ever spoke of Henry again. And because they did not speak, because the records did not name him, Henry Caldwell became a ghost. Not of the supernatural kind, but of the bureaucratic and social kind, a person who ceased to exist because no one dared to remember him. Photographs lie. They always have. A camera captures only what the lens is pointed at, only the moment the shutter opens. It can be staged, manipulated, cropped, and retouched. It can show a smiling family while hiding the bruises beneath their sleeves. It can freeze a moment of peace and erase the chaos that came before and after. But mirrors, at least in the Victorian imagination, were different. Mirrors were believed to reflect truth. In the folklore of the era, mirrors held a peculiar power. They were said to reveal what people tried to hide: their true selves, their guilt, their secrets. A person who could not bear to look in a mirror was thought to be burdened by sin. Vampires, according to legend, cast no reflection because they had no soul. Mirrors were not passive objects. They were witnesses, The Caldwells would have known these beliefs. They would have grown up with stories about mirrors capturing the last image a dying person saw, about mirrors cracking when a lie was told in front of them. And so, when they stood before the mirror in their parlor, preparing for a family portrait meant to project respectability and normalcy, they must have felt the weight of what the mirror knew. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a psychologist who studies guilt and collective memory, reviewed the Caldwell case in 2018. She proposed that the photograph was not a technical anomaly but a psychological one, a manifestation of the family's guilt, rendered visible through the act of posing for the camera. In traumatic situations, she explained, families often create narratives that allow them to continue functioning. They tell themselves a version of events that absolves them or shifts responsibility. But on some level, they know the truth, and that truth finds ways to surface. The mirror in this interpretation was not magical. It was symbolic. The family had erased Henry from their lives, but they could not erase him from the photograph entirely. He was still there, still part of the composition. But the mirror, the truth-teller, the witness, showed what the family had already done in their hearts. They had removed him, and the mirror reflected that removal. Victorian portrait photography was performative. Families dressed in their finest clothes arranged themselves in poses that signaled unity and virtue. The Caldwells were no different. They wanted to present themselves as whole, as respectable. But they could not perform away what they had done. The photograph captured the performance and the truth simultaneously. Henry stood with them, but he was no longer one of them. The mirror made that visible. Dr. Vasquez also noted that guilt often manifests in small, unconscious choices. The family chose to take this photograph, she said. They could have avoided it, waited, commissioned a portrait that did not include the mirror. But they didn't. On some level, they wanted this image to exist. They wanted a record of what they had done, even if they could never admit it aloud. The photograph, then, was not just evidence of a crime. It was a confession. A silent, coded confession that the family left behind, knowing that someday, someone might see it and understand. For 3 years, the Caldwell photograph circulated among historians, forensic analysts, and archivists. Theories multiplied. Skeptics suggested elaborate hoaxes. Believers argued for supernatural explanations. But in the spring of 2019, a graduate student named Mara Holt, working on her thesis about Victorian mourning practices, noticed something no one else had. She was studying the photograph under magnification, focusing on the clothing and accessories that might indicate social status or recent bereavement. Victorian families often wore mourning jewelry, rings, brooches, and lockets containing locks of hair from the deceased. Mara scanned the image for such details, and then she saw it. On Evelyn Caldwell's left hand, partially obscured by the folds of her dress, was a ring. It was small, dark, and easy to miss, but under magnification, its design became clear. A narrow band with a tiny glass compartment, inside of which was a coil of light-colored hair. Mourning jewelry, the kind worn to commemorate a dead child. Mara cross-referenced the photograph's date, March 17, 1909, with the timeline of Henry's disappearance. The photograph was taken weeks, possibly days, after whatever had happened to him. Evelyn was already wearing mourning jewelry. She was already grieving. But there had been no public death, no funeral, no announcement. The mourning was private, hidden, worn like a secret. Mara expanded her analysis to the rest of the family. Thomas Caldwell's posture was stiff, his hand on Evelyn's shoulder not affectionate but controlling, as if holding her in place. Margaret and Charles stood apart from their parents, their expressions unreadable but tense. And Henry stood at the front, closest to the camera, as if placed there deliberately. His eyes, wide and unblinking, stared directly at the lens. His hands, folded at his waist, were positioned in the same manner as a child laid out for a post-mortem photograph, a common practice in the Victorian era when a family's only image of a deceased child was taken after death. Mara's findings were published in a peer-reviewed journal later that year. The mourning ring, the post-mortem posture, the timeline, all of it pointed to the same conclusion. Henry Caldwell was dead when the photograph was taken. Or, if not dead, he was dying, already lost to the family in every way that mattered. The photograph was not a family portrait. It was a memorial. And the mirror, showing a family of 4, had already accepted what the Caldwells could not admit. The final detail came from the studio itself. Whitmore and Sons kept meticulous records of every portrait they produced, including notes on client requests and special instructions. Mara obtained access to the studio's archive and found the entry for March 17, 1909. The note, written in faded ink, read, "Caldwell family portrait. Client requested the boy be positioned at center, facing forward. Mirror visible in background per client instruction. No retouching. The mirror was not incidental. It was requested. The Caldwells wanted the mirror in the photograph. They wanted the truth to be visible, even if they could never speak it. And the photographer, perhaps understanding more than he was paid to know, honored the request without question. The Caldwell family left Springfield in 1915. They moved to a small town called Carterville, more than 100 miles south, where no one knew their name and no one asked questions. Thomas found work as a clerk. Evelyn kept house. Margaret and Charles attended school, grew into adulthood, and built lives that bore no trace of the past. They never spoke of Henry. They never returned to Ashford Lane. And when they died, Margaret in 1974, Charles in 1981, their obituaries made no mention of a younger brother. But history does not forget as easily as people do. The photograph remained, passed down through estate sales and archive donations, until it surfaced in 2014. And when it did, the truth it had held for more than a century finally emerged. In 2020, a descendant of the Caldwell family, a great-granddaughter of Charles, came forward after reading about the photograph online. Her name was Rebecca Landry, and she had grown up hearing whispers about a family tragedy that no one would explain. "My grandmother told me once that her father never talked about his childhood," Rebecca said in an interview. "She said there was a brother, but he died very young, and it broke the family. She didn't know how or why. She just knew they never spoke his name." Rebecca requested to see the photograph. When she did, she wept. "I always felt like there was something missing in our family history," she said. "Like there was a hole no one wanted to fill. And now I know why. They erased him. They pretended he never existed. But he did. He was real. And whatever happened to him, he deserved to be remembered." The house at 412 Ashford Lane was eventually demolished in 2021. The owners, aware of the photograph's history, chose not to preserve it. But before the house came down, they removed the mirror. It now hangs in a small museum in Springfield, accompanied by a placard that tells the story of the Caldwell family and the photograph that revealed their secret. Visitors stand before it, searching their own reflections, wondering what truths mirrors hold. Henry Caldwell was 7 years old when he vanished. He left behind no letters, no belongings, no grave. But he left behind a photograph that captured his presence and his absence, his life and his erasure, all in a single frame. And in the mirror behind him, the truth waited patiently, reflected and undeniable, for more than 100 years. Some photographs preserve memories, others bury them, and a rare few do both, holding the past in a grip so tight that even time cannot loosen it. The Caldwell portrait is one of those. It is a document of love and violence, of guilt and silence, of a family that chose to forget and a mirror that refused to let them. Henry Caldwell is gone, but in the reflection or the absence of one, he remains.